This is Ed Rep Radio, presented by Eastman Music Company. This is Ed Rep Radio, a podcast to bring you ideas and information from industry experts you can use on the road every day. Presented by Eastman Music Company, and I'm your host, Shane Duell. As an Ed Rep working with string instruments out in the field, you see lots of different issues form with these instruments that may require the attention of a string repair tech, or luthier as they're often called. Things like open seams, cracks, changing string heights, slipping pegs. The cause of all these problems can be a bit of a mystery to you and the teachers you call on. We're going to solve a few of these mysteries on this episode with a great luthier from the Eastman Strings shop with many years of experience working on these school instruments, Ralph Alcala. Ralph is joining us from the Eastman Music Company headquarters in Pomona, California. Ralph, I know you're busy out there in the setup shop. Thanks for taking the time to join us today.
Hey, Shane. Happy to be here.
So, Ralph, before we jump into all of this stuff about the string instruments and why things happen to them, I was hoping to learn a little bit more about you and what you do for Eastman.
So what I do is quality control in the shop, training of luthiers, product design for double basses and future cello, viola, and violins. I also oversee just general quality of the instruments in the shop.
So I'd love to know what your path was to bring you to Eastman and kind of where you started back as an early luthier.
Well, I started in 2003, my senior year in high school. I started working with a violin maker in Garden Grove, California, mostly on the weekends. Being the curious high school kid, I took apart my bass just
what?
Because, yeah.
You took apart your bass?
Yeah, there was a crack on the neck, and it always bugged me, and I ended up upgrading to a better bass. So I had my K bass, and that crack always bugged me. So I said, how hard can this be? So I dug the neck out. I completely ruined the mortise. And once I had the neck out, I was completely lost. So I found this violin maker in Garden Grove, and I asked him if he can help me put it back in. Being a high school kid, I had no money. So I said, we can trade work. He was an older gentleman, so he needed help around the house, just getting stuff done. So he agreed. He took me on. Every Saturday and Sunday, I would go to his house, would work 4 hours mowing his lawn, helping him around the house, cleaning up his house, whatever. And the other 4 hours, he would help me or teach me how to fix my bass. And that went on for 4 or 5 months until my bass was done. And once that was done, he said, well, you have good hands. Do you want to learn about violins, violas, cellos? I said, yeah. Did that the rest of my senior year. And once I was about to graduate high school, he said, well, you can either go to violin making school or you can find an apprenticeship, being that I wanted to focus on double basses. I'm a bass player. I'm a classically trained bass player. I wanted to focus on that. So he said, okay, well, there's a shop in Long Beach. They focus on bass primarily, and go talk to John. So went, talked to John, left my number, and 2 days after I graduated high school, he gave me a call, offered me a temporary job to fix school instruments, and I was there for almost 10 years.
Wow. You've seen it all then.
Yeah, I've repaired anything with strings. I've repaired it or worked on it, except for pianos.
Except very different animal, I assume.
Yeah. But if it had strings on it, I've worked on it.
Well, that's great. So you're the perfect person to talk to then. If you've worked on all of these school instruments, you've seen what all of these ed reps have seen out there in the field. And I'd love to dig into really why these things happen and some of the most common issues. When you were a repair person, what did you see most common and why did they happen?
The most common issue is open seams. That's the most common thing that will happen to any instrument. Any string instrument is an open seam.
Why?
So string instruments, they're designed to have their seams pop open. When you have humidity drop or go up way too high, these instruments breathe. They'll take in water and they'll release water. So when there's a lot of, when an instrument's drying out, it's shrinking. The belly, the top and the back will shrink, and there's tension. The ribs won't shrink in the same direction, so the top will shrink. And instead of, that's a lot of tension, and that tension has to go somewhere. So instead of creating a crack on the top, it will release that tension on the seam. That way you can open up the seam a little bit more and then glue it back in to a state where there's less tension on the top.
Okay.
Same thing with the back. They're designed that way. We use hide glue for that reason.
Good. So it's not necessarily a defect of the instrument. It's actually designed that way, regardless of the quality or level of the instrument, right?
Correct.
Do Stradivari cellos do the same thing?
Yeah. It doesn't matter. You want a seam to pop open, because that's telling you that there's tension somewhere in the instrument, and you want the seam to pop open instead of a crack on the top or the back.
Yeah, and cracks, as you would know, being a repair person, they're probably a lot more intensive to fix and a lot more expensive.
A lot more expensive.
So when a seam does open, I suppose an ed rep could, to a teacher who maybe doesn't understand what we just talked about, they could explain that the top or the back or whatever opened up is under tension, and it's actually a good thing that the seams opened up. Is that accurate?
Correct, yeah.
So how do you glue it back together, I guess, is a question. Once you see that they're open, what do you do? What's the next step?
Well, the first thing you want, as soon as you find an open seam, you want to take it to get repaired right away. If the instrument is still under string tension, the instrument will start warping. It will start twisting, because some of the higher end strings create more tension than the lower end strings. So the instrument will start to twist. So as soon as you find a seam, go take it to the shop, and it's usually a lot cheaper and easier to do once you do it right away. If you let it pop open a little bit more and a little bit more, the instrument will start to twist, and it's a lot harder to move back and glue. Yeah,
that makes sense. So take the tension off once you find the open seam.
Right.
Loosen those pegs.
Yeah, you just loosen the strings a little bit, a whole step, half step, just bring it down a little bit, take it to your shop, and it's usually a lot cheaper to glue it right away than waiting.
And it's a pretty basic repair, right? To glue seams back together?
Yep. You get a little spatula, a little bit of hot water, you kind of rub the inside seam, you clean out the old glue, and then you throw on some new hide glue, clamp it up, and you're pretty much set. 24 hours later, you're done.
All right. So you shouldn't go down to Home Depot and grab some Gorilla Glue or Elmer's glue and glue that back up?
No.
Oh, okay.
Hide glue is designed to be water soluble.
Okay.
White glue or Gorilla Glue. I've seen people use super glue, hide white glue, Gorilla Glue, epoxy. All that stuff is almost waterproof. So once it's on there, it's almost impossible to take off. So hide glue, when you throw a little bit of hot water in there, it'll come apart.
Okay.
So a lot of the repairs that we do are reversible. That's why we use hide glue, because you can reverse whatever you do. Epoxy, Gorilla Glue, it's permanent.
Oh, you do it and then it's done.
And it's done.
So don't let Dad at home, when the kid has an open seam on his cello, don't let Dad near it with his Gorilla Glue.
Correct, yeah.
So one question, it's always interesting. Why do they call it hide glue? And it's Hide, hide glue.
Right. It's an animal byproduct. They'll boil up cows, horses, all that stuff, the cartilage, the sinew, all that stuff, and you get this gelatinous product. And they refine it, they clean it, and it gets cleaner and cleaner. The strength, the glue strength goes down the more you refine it. Eventually, that becomes gelatin, Jello.
Interesting. Animal Jello.
Well, it becomes Jello. That's what they use. That's what Jello is.
Oh, you mean Jello, like the stuff we eat.
Right. So it'll get so refined it becomes food grade.
Huh. Interesting.
So when you see hide glue, actually, I mix it in the water, it expands. You heat it up, it looks like Jello. when it kind of cools down a little bit.
I will never look at Jell-O the same way again.
Yeah, I know. Once I found out, I kind of stopped eating Jell-O.
So open seams, number one. And I'm sure ed reps see that all the time. How do you, some open seams are so obvious because they're open like an inch.
Right.
And sticking in the back or the top is sticking away from the sides of the ribs. If it's not so obvious, how do you check for open seams? Is there a trick out there that ed rep could use?
Yeah, so what you can do is, what I use is the knuckle on my finger. I just go along the purfling and I just kind of knock on that purfling. And, if it's solid, if it's glued, you'll have, a very distinct sound. Once you hit an open seam, it'll be more of a tick. That sound will change immediately.
Okay.
So, as you're knocking the whole edge of the instrument and you hit an open seam, you'll hear like a high tick.
So you'd hear like a thump, 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 tick.
Exactly.
Good trick.
Yep.
And even if it's a minor open seam, you should get that in and glued up before it gets worse, right?
Correct.
So when in your time as a repair person on these school instruments, open seams were number one. What else did you see?
We will see string fluctuation. Strings will go up and down depending on the area you live in.
Up and down from the fingerboard?
Yeah, from the fingerboard.
Height?
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is, like I said earlier, these instruments will take in water and will release it as it's available to them. So when you soak something in water, it expands.
Okay.
Same thing happens with wooden instruments. As it takes in water, it will expand a little bit. So sometimes when the humidity is really high, your strings will go up.
So they'll literally get higher above the fingerboard.
Correct.
When it's humid.
Yep. And when it dries out, the strings will go down.
It's almost like it's breathing.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you think of, when it's really dry and you can feel it, you'll feel it on your lips. Your lips will kind of get chapped. It's basically the skin on your lips will shrink and crack.
Okay.
So
then you put your chapstick on.
And then you moisturize it, and it'll even out. It'll kind of plump up a little bit. Or even if you just hydrate, you'll feel it on your lips first. Mm-hmm. Same exact concept for instruments. As they're drying out, they're shrinking and they want to crack open because there's tension. So, so it's not a defect in the instrument. That's what wood does.
Okay.
There's really no way to 100% stabilize wood.
Okay. So physically, what's happening in the instrument itself? Let's say we have a cello that maybe when an ed rep sold this instrument to the teacher, the strings were fine. They were at the proper height. And then several months later, the teacher calls the ed rep and say, hey, these strings are super close to the fingerboard and they're buzzing. Can you talk about physically what happened to this instrument to cause this change in height of strings? What really is happening there?
Well, what will happen is, for example, Colorado, Utah, those areas are extremely dry. Mm-hmm. And what's going on is, as soon as the instrument leaves our shop in Pomona, our humidity level will be, anywhere from 35% up to 60%.
Okay.
It's a good humidity range. It will go up to Utah, where the humidity level can be anywhere from 5% to 15%. Mm-hmm. And the instrument would just get shocked. All that moisture is getting sucked out of the instrument. So it's shrinking. So when the belly shrinks, the strings will drop.
What are you calling the belly?
The top.
Okay.
So it's curved, so we call that like a belly.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
I can see it. Yeah.
So, when you have the top and the back shrinking, everything's just kind of, the belly kind of just comes down.
I see.
And the strings will come down.
So the feet of the bridge are sitting on the belly.
Right.
And basically, it's like someone's sucking in that belly.
Right.
And that bridge is dropping down.
Right.
And then bringing the strings down with it.
Right. So
I get it.
Shop that's buying instruments, they, personally, like I have, humidity gauges all over my own shop. I know the humidity in the morning, in the afternoon, and at night. I know when it's going to be dry, when it's going to be humid. So I know to anticipate some of these things. Most shops should do the same. They know if a shop in Colorado or Utah is bringing in instruments, he's like, oh, just leave the bridges high because we know it's going to shrink. I have friends in Arizona, same deal. They'll ask for instruments who will want the bridge to be uncut because they'll have their instruments sit there for a month or two, let it settle, let it shrink a little bit, then they'll set up their instruments. They won't just set
kind
them
of like they're acclimatizing.
Exactly.
So with the string heights going higher from the fingerboard and lower to the fingerboard, is this kind of a constant thing? If they're breathing in and out, are these strings kind of constantly moving then?
Yeah, some instruments will acclimatize right away. Some of them, I've worked on old instruments that have been in the United States for 100 years, and they still move. I had a client in the LA Opera who his string height would literally move anywhere from 3 to 5 millimeters.
Wow.
Within, every 6 months. So
Wow.
I had a bridge specifically for one season and another bridge for, the next 6 months.
Interesting. So they would change their bridge height out as the strings were moving, essentially.
Right. Yeah.
That's probably something schools don't do.
Correct. Yeah, it's expensive to have two bridges.
Yeah.
Or people like in the Midwest, or in the East Coast, they know you have your summer post and your winter post.
Your sound post.
Your sound post, yeah.
Oh, so that's changing too.
Yeah, for higher end instruments, personal instruments, that's what they do because they know when it's winter you need a shorter post. When it's summer you need a longer post because the instruments are moving.
Okay. That's interesting because it kind of brings us into maybe the next issue to talk about, and that would be sound post cracks.
Yeah. So it's the same thing. It's the humidity that these instruments are breathing. So if you have a super dry climate and you have a sound post that was cut for a higher humidity level, it's going to create a crack eventually. Maybe the instrument will just stabilize that way and not crack, but chances are it might. So a lot of shops should be checking their sound post. Every time they get brought in to get checked up, they should be moving those sound posts, making sure that they're snugly fit, but not tight.
Okay. So when that belly shrinks and that sound post isn't changing its length, it's putting a lot of pressure on that top, right?
On the top and the back.
And that's what they're checking for. If it's super tight, that's probably saying that belly is pressing on that sound post really hard.
Right.
Okay. Any tips for schools who maybe don't have two sound posts or can't afford to go into a shop all the time to have that sound post checked?
Well, I always recommend teachers to take some kind of basic course on sound posts, just maintaining their instrument. If they have a sound post setter, they can kind of move their sound post a little bit, maybe find an old busted violin and just practice taking that sound post in and out. Take it in and out, get that practice in. So if you can move your sound post and check that it's fit properly and not too tight, you can just check each instrument a couple a week throughout, the school year. Just make sure that they're not too tight.
So are there other issues that you saw fairly often in your time as a repair person with these school instruments?
Well, everything else was just kids being kids, a lot of, I opened up the case and it was broken, a lot of that.
Spontaneous combustion.
Exactly.
Yeah, you see that a lot in string instruments.
They look like they've been run over and it's like the kid's like, I don't know what happened.
It wasn't me, I promise.
Yeah. Kids are hard on instruments. It's rare to find a kid that's very dedicated with their instrument. They're tossing them. They're going to soccer practice. They're getting thrown in the trunk. They're being tossed around pretty well. So broken headstocks, broken necks, cracks caused by impact, a lot of that.
What's the most common kind of crack you would see in particularly cellos and basses?
Cellos and basses, a lot of rib cracks. they're big
Ribs.
instruments.
Okay. The sides for
Yeah.
people who learning their terminology here. The ribs are the sides.
Yeah. A lot of, for bass players, they'll carry their basses bass first. So as they're walking with the bass extended out. So they turn a corner or they hit a leg, table, sharp corners, and they'll puncture those ribs. I see that a lot. Same thing with cellos. Kids sometimes can't judge distance when they're setting down their instrument sometimes. So they'll kind of plop down an instrument real quick. So that end pin will hit the end block, create a rib crack or create a top crack. And then for a luthier, I've seen enough rib repairs to where I can see the very small details of rib fractures and impact. Some impacts will show you, like spider, on the varnish. It'll look like a spider. It'll show you that pinpoint of impact.
Like a crater on the moon.
Right. So, if you drop it down on the end pin, you kind of see little stress marks everywhere. You kind of have to really pay attention, but they're there. A lot of busted edges, a lot of busted corners, Kids are just moving around with a lot of these instruments. A lot of busted scrolls and necks.
Yeah, I've seen that. The bigger they are, the harder they fall, right?
Right. So I've done a lot of neck resets. I've done a lot of scroll, repairs as they're putting these instruments down. Sometimes they just let go just a little too early. An inch or two being dropped down, it's a lot of stress flexing. That string tension is a lot. It's a couple 100 pounds of string tension. So when that takes a shock, it reverberates, throughout the whole instrument.
So it doesn't take a lot, is what you're saying.
Not at all. Yeah. It doesn't take. It can take a little small shock in the right place, and it'll crack somewhere just because it's just in the right place.
Good tip for those students: be careful.
Yeah.
Do you ever see a crack happen because of weather as opposed to an impact?
Sure. Yeah. These are wooden instruments. Wood is unpredictable. Sometimes if the humidity drops down way too fast, it doesn't give the seam enough time to pop open to release it, and it will just create a crack. Sometimes here in California, we have what's called the Santa Ana winds. And we'll go from 35-40% humidity down to 10 within 2 hours.
Wow,
that's massive swing in humidity. So I can hear cracks forming. Sometimes I've had pieces of wood that in my shop, and I'll just hear a loud pop, and it's it doesn't.
You literally hear it.
Oh
pop.
yeah, I'll hear it.
Wow.
Yeah, I've heard it in my own personal shop. I've heard it in former shops that I've worked in. You'll hear instruments creaking and moving and trying to release that pressure. But sometimes that change is too drastic, and it'll just create a crack on the top or the rib or the back.
Wow. I've heard stories of teachers literally having rehearsal, and then they hear this like almost a gunshot in the storage room, and it was something popping open.
Yep.
You've seen that?
Oh yeah, I've heard it many times. Yeah, it's scary because when you're focused on something or you're deeply concentrated on something and you just hear like a loud crack or pop or it's and plus it's a string instrument. It's meant to reverberate and amplify whatever sounds going through that instrument. It'll sound even bigger. So yeah, it can be shocking sometimes.
That's wild. That can happen, and it's from quick change in humidity or temperature,
right?
And the instrument just can't take it.
Right.
Is there anything else? Another thing that you might have seen out there fairly often that ed reps should be aware of?
I always emphasize school teachers to, and so I know sometimes it can be almost impossible, but try to keep your room humidified. I know during the winter months when the heat's going, those heaters are just sucking the humidity out of the rooms. If you can have a humidifier somewhere near the instruments or have instrument-specific humidifiers inside the instruments, that's going to save your instruments in the long run. That's always something that you should always keep on top of. Temperature is, if you're within normal temperatures, you'll usually be okay.
Okay.
But what's more important than that is the humidity levels. That's really what you should be looking at.
So it can be a little chilly in the room as long as there's enough humidity.
Correct.
And the instrument will be okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there kind of a temperature range that you would say is safe for a string instrument? There must be some extremes out there that we want to avoid.
Yeah, as long as you're not above 90 degrees for a long time, you should be fine. It can be cold. You know, a lot of people like to say, oh, it's in danger if it's getting cold. It's not really that. It's the humidity drops down when it gets cold because there's heaters. Mm-hmm. Though it's like, oh, it's cold, that's why it cracked. Like, no, it's cold, and you have your heater on, that's why it cracked. The humidity dropped down because the heater's on.
That makes sense. I have this in my house here. I have this hygrometer that has a sensor outside, and then there's a sensor inside. And it's really interesting. I'm here in Colorado where it's really dry.
Right.
It's interesting. In the winter, it'll be, 15 degrees. And it'll say the humidity is, especially when there's snow on the ground, it'll say it's 50 or 60% humidity.
Right.
And then in the house, it'll be 70 degrees, and it's 6% humidity.
Right. Because your
So you're
heater's
saying
on.
it's, yeah. So you're saying it's that 6% humidity.
Right.
That's really dangerous for these string instruments.
Right. Yeah, that's what causes cracks.
Yeah, and you see it all the time in schools, right? So they're cranking up the heat when it's cold outside, and the relative humidity inside is sometimes single digits.
Right.
Would you recommend keeping some sort of hygrometer in there too with the strings where they're being stored?
Yeah, you can find like a digital one on Amazon for $10, and having it somewhere where you can see it every day really helps you understand why certain things are happening. If you have a week of single digit humidity, it's like, oh, maybe I should go check on my instrument, see if there's seams popping or there's cracks forming or something. It's a constant reminder to just check your instruments to see if certain things are happening. Sometimes if they're being stored for too long and you have a dry spell for too long, you won't see those cracks until you open the instruments.
Right. So what is safe? What's a good humidity level inside for these instruments to be stored at?
I would say 30. Your lowest should be 30%.
Okay.
25 is pushing it. It can go for a few days like that, maybe a little bit lower, but not for too long. These instruments have to get slowly used to that low humidity. So if you're having a new batch of instruments come in, throw a humidifier in the room. You can go to Walmart or Amazon, just buy something that just pumps out a lot of water just to kind of slowly let those instruments get used to that low humidity. After a while, most of those instruments will get used to that low humidity.
Oh, so you can actually have it slowly acclimatize to a dry climate.
Right.
And it'll be okay, but it has to do it slowly.
It has to do it
doesn't
slowly.
like that shock, right?
Right.
Ah, good to know. So, a lot of times ed reps will get phone calls after the holidays, and the instruments will be sitting in the orchestra room. The school turns the heat down or off, and then students come back and they crank the heat up. And then every year, after teachers get back to the classroom, ed reps get that phone call that teachers are saying their seams are opening, they have cracks in the top, they have strings sitting on the fingerboard. What happened there?
So it's that shock. It's that big swing. So if you turn off the heat, yeah, the temperature goes down, but the humidity is staying constant. But somebody comes into the room, flips on the heater, and it's just pumping hot air, trying to bring that temperature up, and it's just sucking that humidity out as fast as it can.
In a matter of a day or two, right?
Exactly. So you might be at 30, 40, 50%. Like you said, it's 20 degrees outside, but humidity level is 40, 50, and you're trying to come up from 50 to 70, and that heater is just working overtime. So that humidity is just shooting down like a rocket. And it's
that quick change.
It's that huge shock to the instrument where it's just hydrated one moment and the next day it's just getting sucked dry.
Is there anything a teacher can do to help keep that from happening or not put those instruments through that kind of shock when there's a break at the school?
When you're coming back to the school, if you can throw on a humidifier, as they're throwing on the heat, that will help.
Okay.
Don't open up all your instruments, to go check them right away, because the case it's a barrier, so it'll kind of keep some of that humidity in there and slowly release it. So just let the instruments sit there for a few days before you start opening them and checking them. So that'll help as well.
That's interesting. Let's talk about that. So you just said keep the instruments in the cases.
Yeah.
But all the time, ed reps walk into an orchestra room and there's a cello rack or a bass rack, and the cases are stored on top of a shelf somewhere.
Right.
And the instruments are sitting on these cello racks with no cases. That's a bad thing?
It doesn't help. I know how difficult it can be to put all the instruments in their cases, especially basses and cellos, and then put those somewhere. With a case, they're hard to store. I understand that. So if you do have basses that are out on racks or cellos that are on racks, it's really important to have a humidifier near them, just so they're receiving some kind of humidity as the temperature's coming up.
And perhaps maybe on some of those longer breaks, actually put them in their cases. Will that help some of that shock from happening?
It should help, yeah.
Okay. So outside of the instruments, we have other things that string players use. What kind of maintenance or care tips or weather issues happen to things like bows?
Yeah, the hair is the most susceptible to those humidity changes. If you notice, if you have curly hair and you have a humid day, it puffs up.
Mm-hmm.
So same thing it's horsehair that's on our bows. When the humidity goes up, that hair kind of loosens up because it's receiving a lot of humidity, and it'll take it in and it'll kind of loosen up. So sometimes you'll have school teachers or someone's like, oh well, I can't tighten this anymore and it's still loose, or it's too tight, I can't loosen it anymore. Same thing, it's the humidity range. People.
So the hair is breathing too.
Yeah. Yeah. So, for example, when I used to do rehairs, if I had a client in, let's say, Arizona, I would leave the hair just a little long, knowing that as soon as they got to Arizona, it would tighten up. Or if I had someone in Florida, and I would rehair their bow in California, I would make that hair just a tad tight, almost to tension here, and once it got to Florida, it would loosen up because it would receive some of that more humidity than it did here. Throughout the season, in the wintertime, the hair is going to tighten up. In the summertime, when the humidity goes up, it's going to be a little more, or in the springtime, it's going to be a little bit more loose.
You see teachers quite often preaching to their students to loosen the bow at the end of rehearsal.
Right.
Why is that?
So hair it's a natural product. It will stretch. Every time you tighten it, it just stretches just a little bit. And when it reaches its point where it can't stretch anymore, it will break. So that's the first thing. You want to make sure that you make that hair last as long as you can. But you also don't, if you have a wooden bow, wood has memory. You can heat up a piece of wood, bend it, and once it cools down, it will hold that shape. All the cells in that piece of wood have rearranged itself to where it's comfortable in that curved state. So when you leave a bow tightened, and maybe at some point you leave it in the car for a little bit, that heat rises, it'll bend with that tension on it.
Okay.
So it'll stay with less curve because it was left tight.
Okay, so loosen your bows.
Yeah.
All right. Can you talk about some common things that you would see as a repair person dealing with bridges, and some things that maybe ed rep should watch out for and alert teachers to?
Yeah, so teachers should always be very comfortable adjusting their bridge. So when you tune an instrument, you're stretching the string over a bridge. So it's pulling that bridge towards you, towards the nut of the instrument. So
towards those pegs, right?
Yeah, towards the pegs. Yeah. So it'll lean forward just a bit. So most of my clients, I would always, I would help them, train them. It's like, okay, if you see that the back of the foot of the bridge is you see that gap, you want to push down on the bridge, make sure it's nice and straight. So a lot of teachers should be comfortable adjusting these bridges. So as you let that bridge tilt forward, it'll start creating pressure, an uneven pressure on the backside. So it'll start curving the bridge. If it's
It'll literally curve the bridge, like a warp almost.
Right. Sometimes it's just the grain of the wood. So sometimes the wood on lower end instruments may not be the best, but for that instrument quality level, it's what's appropriate. But if you keep up with your maintenance, adjusting your bridges, making sure they're nice and straight, or if it's something that's consistent, that's happening the same instrument over and over and over, take it to your dealer, to your local string shop. Maybe they can correct it or refit the bridge to where it's, stands up nice and straight.
Good. It sounds like something that maybe an ebb rep can do when they're standing in the back of the room waiting for the teacher to have a break.
Sure.
Check that cello rack.
Yeah.
And see if they're leaning towards that peg box.
Right.
And see if those feet are sitting on top. So does it actually warp enough or curve enough to the point where it cracks?
Yes. It's you bend any piece of wood enough, it will start to splinter and crack or just snap. So yeah, if I've seen some amazingly curved bridges, and I have no idea how they stayed on or how they held on, but yeah, they'll reach a point where they'll just snap and break off.
So why can't you take a bridge just out of a box and throw it on an instrument and it works?
So all these instruments, they're all just a little different. It can be, the arching can just be half a millimeter different on each instrument. You can't make each one exactly the same. It's impossible. Every piece of wood is different, so it'll breathe differently. Some woods will breathe a little bit more, vice versa. So we have to fit the feet of the bridge. We have to make sure that they're standing up nice and straight. We have to, curve, to shape everything about the bridge and put on the string height for each instrument. So one bridge, if you take it off and put it on a different violin, it might be close, but it won't be exact.
What happens if you have a poorly fitted bridge on an instrument?
It can cause any number of things. It can cause, if it's not properly fit, it can just roll over. If the feet aren't properly fit and nice and straight, it can just, with string tension, it'll just roll over, and you'll have your tailpiece hit the top of the instrument, or just that initial shock of all that tension just going away can create a crack. A poorly fit feet on bridges can add more pressure on one point of the foot instead of an evenly distributed pressure. So it can create a crack that way, or it can damage varnish. That's why it's really important to have someone properly fit a bridge instead of just, we'll just throw it on there, you're good to go.
Will it affect the sound at all if it's like a well-fitted bridge versus not well-fitted bridge? Does it affect the sound of the instrument at all?
It definitely does.
Oh.
Yeah. When you have, a trumpet where those solder points aren't connected very well, you'll feel like weird vibrations.
Right.
If something will be off, the instrument will vibrate in a weird way. It's the same thing. The vibrations from the strings going through the bridge aren't being properly transferred into the body of the instrument to be pushed back out. If you have 30% of your foot touching the body, that's a small amount of bridge foot, that those vibrations are traveling through. You need a properly fit bridge, making sure those vibrations are going through the instrument and back out.
Yeah, that makes sense. It makes more sense now why it costs, say, $150 to have a new cello bridge put on, because there's a lot to it, it sounds like. It's not just throwing a new one on.
Right, yeah.
Another common thing that I was hoping to kind of get to the bottom to is why pegs stick or why they slip.
It all goes back to humidity. Pegs are a natural piece of wood. They will shrink, they will expand. Not at the same rate as your scroll. So most of the times scrolls are maple. And the way maple releases water is different from ebony or rosewood or boxwood. So these pegs and the scroll are releasing and getting water at different rates. So sometimes maybe the scroll is expanding too much and it'll just release that peg. So that peg will just slip. So you have to sometimes just unwind your peg, clean off the old peg compound, reapply new compound, and see if it works again.
Okay.
Sometimes you have to get those pegs refit. Shave down just a little bit because pegs do warp. It's a contact point where it's constantly being rubbed and worn away. If you rub a piece of wood long enough, you'll start to see a divot.
Right.
Like if you have an old coffee table where you set your coffee mug at the same place, you'll start to see a ring and then a divot, and then that little place just gets worn away. Same thing with pegs. The peg holes will wear out. The pegs will wear. Sometimes they have to be replaced or just shaved down and refit.
Okay, so it's a normal thing for pegs to over time just start to need a little care and maintenance.
They're like car brakes. They have to be they get worn down. They have to be replaced.
Yeah. You mentioned compound. Is that the same thing as peg dope?
Yes.
Okay. What does that do?
It's kind of like a paste where it has a bit of grain in it, and there's different levels of it. Some will be more coarse, some will be less. Basically what it does is it helps you, slide and turn that peg while still creating some kind of friction where it'll just hold on as soon as you let go.
Okay. Is that something an ed rep could do for a teacher, or a teacher could do themselves, or does that require some advanced skills in a string shop?
Nope. Just take the peg out. If you have some on hand, just right where it's touching the peg, apply some. It's like chapstick. Just apply some there and put it back in. Just don't use too much. If you start seeing that it's accumulating way too much, where there's more compound than actual peg, then just clean it off. Maybe a little bit of sandpaper and just put it back in.
Okay. Anything else, Ralph, that you saw in your days as a repair person, or you see now that you feel like ed reps or teachers would really benefit from knowing?
Always clean your strings.
Oh.
Kids are not the best at washing their hands. So, your hands have natural oils. Your face does, your hands do, there's natural oils on your hands. So when you have these kids who are just touching these instruments after a full day of doing whatever, all that stuff goes on your strings. So strings, there's winding. There's winding that goes throughout the whole string. And as you bring them up to tension, they spread out just a little bit. You can barely see it with your eyes, but there are some strings that will stretch more than others. And those oils will get in there. And as soon as you take your string tension down, those windings will close back up. And sometimes, especially on bass strings, it's kind of gross, you'll see those oils kind of squeeze out.
Oh.
So if you don't regularly clean off your strings after each use, all that oil, all that dirt, all that gunk is seeping into your string and just literally wearing away at the core of your string. So the lifespan of your string will get shortened up significantly.
How do you clean a string?
After each use, you can just get like a rag, t-shirt material, and just wipe it down. That's your best bet. If you need to do a more deep clean, just a little bit of alcohol and just wipe the string down. Just make sure you don't get it on the instrument, but just a little bit of alcohol on a rag and just wipe your string down. You'll be amazed at how much comes off of that.
Wow. I've seen a lot of instruments, especially big instruments, where the rosin's a little stickier.
Yeah.
A lot of rosin buildup down there. Would you clean it off the same way?
Yes.
Just a rag?
Just a rag. Base rosin is a lot stickier. It is a lot more aggressive. So you have to be a little bit more careful with those strings. Just be a little bit more diligent about wiping them down. And then, with alcohol a little bit more often.
Okay. On the topic of strings, other than an obvious thing like a broken string, how long should strings really be on there? It seems like bass strings never break. So how long should you actually have a bass set of strings on there, and how often should you replace them?
That's a little tough to say. Depends on the string. Personally, I used to change my strings once every 8 months to a year.
Wow.
But that was me.
Okay.
I used to play a lot. I used to, gig all the time. So I would change my strings constantly. I've had professional bass players, in major orchestras playing the same strings for 20 years.
What?
Yeah.
The same set of strings
Same
for 20
set of
years.
strings. Yeah. I knew one bass player in a major orchestra, a top 5 orchestra, who, when his string was going out of business in, I want to say the 80s, he bought all he could. And he bought out the entire stock just so he can play that same exact string. And I think he broke one string in 20 years.
Amazing.
And he just played the same set. So knowing that some schools' budgets are tight, I'm not going to say change your strings every year. That's massive amounts of money for just strings. Your best bet to have your string life last as long as you can is clean them. Clean them, as often as you can, just to make sure that they last you a long time. Realistically, if you could, every year for violin, viola strings would be ideal. Every 3 to 5 years for basses, cellos, if that would be ideal for schools.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's something an ed rep can kind of keep an eye on and help recommend, all right, it's been a few years on this cello, maybe it's time for a new set of strings.
Yeah. Yeah, you want to check, on contact points like over the bridge, over the nut. It's a contact point. These strings are going back and forth over a piece of wood. So these strings are going to start unwinding on those high contact points. So, you can't really expect a string to last forever. So keep an eye out on those points where the bridge is, where the nut. These windings will start to come apart a little bit more.
Okay. Ralph, Alcala, we so appreciate your time. That was fantastic and really great information that ed reps can use the moment after they're done hearing this podcast and the next time they walk into an orchestra room. Thanks for your time.
Anytime. Happy to be here.
We hope you found the information in this episode useful and something you can use in your everyday life as an ed rep. If there is a topic you'd like to learn more about and have presented on a future episode of Ed Rep Radio, or you'd like to give us some feedback in general, please email us at edrepradio@eastmanstrings.com. To learn more about Eastman Music Company, go to our website, eastmanmusiccompany.com, or give your Eastman rep a call. Thanks, and drive safe.